14 times. We just found out that Hamilton councillors voted 14 times to keep the environmental catastrophe known as Sewergate from Hamiltonians. What kind of leadership do we need on the environment in Hamilton, and what should we be doing as a city for our future, for the future of our children? Well, this is an OShow conversation you're going to want to hear. We can have a better Hamilton. I'm thrilled to be able to bring to our discussion here today Cameron Kroetsch. Cameron, welcome to the program again. This time you're here in the capacity of not only the person who put together the new Sewergate timeline, but also you've done a lot of work on a map about just how much property there really is in Hamilton within the urban boundary. So it's great to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me, Laura. Glad to be back.
Of course, our next guest is somebody that everybody knows because she has been doing the hard work over at Environment Hamilton for years. Lynda Lukasik, it's great to have you back on the OShow.
Really happy to be here again, Laura. Nice to see you.
So let me just start off the top, Cameron, with something that shook me when I saw it. And that was that the Sewergate discussion, the awareness around the 24 billion liters of mixed sewage that had leaked into Chedoke Creek into our world biosphere, that there had been an ongoing discussion around the council table and a knowledge of the issue and votes on the issue dating back before the last election, but that they had actually voted, the old guard councillors, 14 times on Sewergate and deciding to keep it a secret from Hamiltonians. So can you just explain to me how you discovered that and what kind of work it took to find that out? Why was that news to all of us so late into what seems like this never-ending scandal?
For me, the journey started at the sort of end of 2019 when we all discovered through the Hamilton Spectator's story that there had been this leak into, as you say, our biosphere. And so we put a petition out, got thousands of people to sign on to it. And from there, I've been watching the issue. But over time, it started to be clearer and clearer to me that I didn't think everybody else was watching it quite as closely in terms of the timeline. When did this start to happen? When was council aware? And the city decided to post its own timeline. And there's a curious note on there. It said July 27th, 2018, City Council was given a formal information update. That struck me as kind of interesting. And so I looked into it more. And then I started counting some of the votes and think, well, how many times has this been before council? And how many times have they had a chance to discuss this? And discovered that that first formal information update from the city solicitor in July of 2018 was the first of 16 formal and informal reports to them between over the course of 2018 and 2019. And then I thought, well, I'll go back and see if they voted on this, how many times they voted on this formally. And the answer was 14 times at council and at General Issues Committee. And so not to single anyone out, but Councillor Vanderbeek ended up being the one to vote the most number of times. And it was just because, frankly, she attended the most number of meetings on the subject. And she voted to keep the reports confidential all 14 times. And that stood out to me and thought it was important that folks understood that, understood the gravity of this. This isn't just a one-off discussion they had where they found something out and had a quick vote about that, and we all kind of moved on. This was time after 14 times of voting in a row to keep this secret.
Their first job as councillors should be to protect the public safety, shouldn't it? I mean, isn't that job number one? And so for them to conceal from us information that would affect our children, you know, people out in canoes, our pets as they would go and drink the water. And the fact that we had the Indigenous Water Watchers warning, and they still weren't listening. I mean, that's what really gulls me, is that there was just an awareness of the depth and breadth of the issue for so long. And let me just pop over for a second to Lynda. Lynda, what was your reaction when you saw that Cameron had done the digging and found that there had been not one, not two, not three, not 10, but 14 votes to keep the Sewergate information from us?
Very discouraging, and this makes me very angry. And I just want to add, I think the most frustrating thing about this is that when you go back and you look at those timelines, the other reality is that in August of 2018, the Provincial Ministry of the Environment released the Provincial Officer's Order, which is a public document. And this is the other layer of frustration for me. And my understanding is that it was external legal advice to the municipality that was leading to council making these decisions to keep this information confidential. So I find that highly problematic, that at the same time that there's a public provincial document out there, we have outside legal counsel telling the municipality, telling our council not to share this information. And I would add, I recognize the name of the external legal advisor because it's a name that pops up regularly in the work that we do with industrial polluters. So it made me think, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense to me. If you've got an entity that exists to uphold the public good, our local government, why are they taking this kind of advice and direction? Particularly when there are the kinds of risks that you're describing here, Laura. So I think doubly frustrating for me to look at this and to realize that is information that was publicly accessible. Now, I am going to add that the other challenge here is that our provincial ministry doesn't publicly post these provincial officers' orders. So we have no place where we can go to regularly find these orders. And if you don't know it exists, you don't know to ask for it. If you know it exists and you ask for it, it's handed over to you as a community member. So that's another piece as well we need to address.
Was this the same thing, Lynda, that we heard they were asked to post publicly and they just stuck it on the door to one of the staff lounges? Or is this a later iteration of communique from the ministry?
That's exactly it. So in the wording of these orders, when the ministry hands them out, they instruct the perpetrator to post in a visible location. So who's following up and what constitutes a visible location? So we do have now on the city's website, I think it was Councillor Clark who subsequently pushed this motion through a page where all of these orders are publicly posted now. But again, we still don't have that at the provincial level, and very frustrating that we would have councillors make a decision to keep confidential a public document that included all of these details about the magnitude of the spill and more details about the nature of the problem.
Laura, it's really concerning because it's an issue of trust, I think, primarily for residents. So when you have people asking for legal advice, the context should be pretty clear. The council, the city is looking to avoid a risk. You don't ask the top environmental lawyer, as Lynda's saying, one of those folks out there that she knows who's out there defending some of the perpetrators of spills and other kinds of things. You don't ask that person to be involved if there's no big deal, right? Nothing's going on. In fact, that first formal information update wasn't just a random report from staff, it was an information update from the city solicitor. So immediately this was perceived as a legal risk. And for those who don't know, the city's already spent $2 million trying to clean this up, hasn't even begun the proper dredging process, pardon me. Of that, $175,000 has been spent getting legal advice. A lot of that legal advice has turned into the city fighting the ministry when it comes to them trying to impose timelines and deadlines in order to get more time. And so that's constructively what the city's been doing, and using this top legal advice is trying to lower its risk, give itself more time, and avoid some of the penalties incurred here. We haven't even found out yet what the total fine amount or any fine amount would be from the Minister of the Environment when it comes to what happened and what the city let happen. But we know that the city is now estimating that in total, the costs for this may be between approximately $13 million and $18 million, including the $2 million they've already spent just to remediate what's already happened.
It isn't the staff that are paying for it. It isn't councillors that are paying for it. It's Hamilton taxpayers that are paying for it, right? $20 million just on this mistake. So that's the money costs. And I'm glad that you brought it up, Cameron. And I will say that after you came up with the video moment when the mayor voted on the Sewergate issue, the mayor went on radio and admitted that they took legal advice, that they knew about it, right? So, I mean, your work has netted some honesty here, forced honesty, but honesty on this. But Lynda, what about the environmental cost to Sewergate? Because I remember seeing people from the RBG with tears in their eyes talking to the media about it. And there's been so much grief in the environmental community over the devastation to Coots and to the world biosphere. So what has been the cost of Sewergate environmentally, if you could just kind of remind us?
Yeah, it's been significant and it's been heartbreaking. So I'm not going to lie, our urban creek watersheds are beaten up already. And I'll talk, I can talk about Red Hill and the history there. Chinook, it's the same, but this was a particularly egregious impact. And I know for people, players like Royal Botanical Gardens, I think about people like Tice Meyer, who I've known now for such a long time, and he's done so much dedicated work there. And I know it was a crushing blow for the RBG and for stakeholders who've been working so hard as part of the larger harbor watershed remediation to see that kind of impact on that ecosystem, because really it has been a legacy of treatment plant discharges and sewer discharges that have really led to that degradation of Kroetsch. And so the turnaround has been steady and slow, but progress has been made. So I know for many, it's been this feeling that so much good work has been undone. And that's not, in 2021, that's not where we want to be on these issues. That's not where we should be. So this was a really heartbreaking impact. I think that's the best way to describe it.
And I want to just pick up on the heartbreaking a little bit, from people who are very close to the environment, who've been working very hard, who understand its importance, like the people that you've mentioned and yourself, Lynda and Cameron. It's heartbreaking on that level. I think for Hamiltonians, for those of us who aren't as connected to those issues or to that work, it was heartbreaking to know that even after the election, some of the new councillors went along, at least initially, with this idea of this cover-up, of the Kroetsch cover-up, of keeping it from us, what had happened.
A really important feature of this that I think doesn't get highlighted enough is what lengths the previous term of council went to make this as opaque as possible. The very first time you hear this coming up in open public session, you hear Arlene Vanderbeek say, Chedoke Creek contamination. It's quite clearly they're talking about Chedoke Creek contamination. It's clear what the subject is, and it's clear it's a confidential report. Suddenly, it changes, and they have it under this kind of opaque, regulatory legal name, potential regulatory litigation, whatever that could mean. So when new councillors come into this discussion in January of 2019, that's the vague umbrella it's under. It's already been legalized. There's already been advice given. And as far as I can tell, the message is, hey, this has already been vetted by our legal folks, carry on. It takes a while, I think, and would take anyone a while, anyone coming into that kind of opaque environment, a bit to decipher what's going on. Eventually, though, a couple of them do, it appears. And by the third chance they have to vote on the subject, I think it is, I could be wrong there, but about September or so, that's when Maureen Wilson and John Paul Danko first vote against the secrecy. Maureen's the only one that keeps her vote consistent after that point and ends up voting 6 times, not against keeping it secret. So you do see that kind of playing out there, but I do think there was at least a period of time where it was difficult for incoming councillors to figure out what was going on at all.
Lynda, one of the things that came up just recently is the fact that for 12 years now, 12 years, they have not made a decision on taxes on stormwater runoff, if I'm correct, on parking lots and things of that nature, and you can speak better to it than I can. But when I heard, I think Councillor Jackson make the comment that they're still looking for all the pros and cons, that sounds to me like a classic kick the can down the road, like they did with area rating and so many other issues. It's a way of not making a decision, or at least not being held to account for a decision that might be unpopular to some of their base. So Lynda, where are we with this stormwater? Why is it important? What is the cost of that 12-year decision-making process?
Yeah, so this is something we've been advocating for at Environment Hamilton for a long time, fair fees for stormwater. And it's all about ensuring that property owners are contributing to managing the cost involved with proper handling of stormwater. And the reality is we're in a climate emergency. The problem is getting more extreme. I don't need to tell you, right? I mean, we're getting more extreme rain events. And so there is that frustration that we need to move on this issue. As we've been advocating, we've watched more and more Ontario municipalities around us making that commitment. And what we're pushing for is incentivization of positive action. So there are ways that property owners can do the right thing to mitigate impacts on site and reduce the fee they'd have to pay. But others who aren't willing to do that are being required to pay into the system of support that we really crucially need moving forward so that we can mitigate and adapt to climate impacts. So yeah, this is a frustration. That it is being kicked, the can is being kicked down the road because the climate crisis is happening all around us. So I guess we're not surprised that we're seeing a delay again, but really decisions around this should have already been made, and we should have a framework in place that we're implementing. So absolutely, this is very frustrating. It's an essential tool that we need now in our community.
We fall so behind on so many different things in this city because of this obfuscation and these games that are played. When I even think about something like LRT, how many years and how much time and cost it absorbed and staff that were lost, and it goes on and on and on. Cameron, when you look at council and you look at comments like that, we want to see the full pros and cons. We want to have a complete, back to staff, back to staff, back to staff for more. What does that tell you about the leaders around the council table now and their commitment to the environment?
It tells me that commitment is weak, Laura, that the folks around the council table aren't willing to take some of the brave and I think sometimes common sense steps. We saw that around the urban boundary discussion for sure, where you had to see a huge outpouring of public effort, surveys, responses, organizing, to get council to make what I think was one of the most common sense decisions in front of them. Do we expand into our farmland and take that farmland away from future generations during a time of immense climate impact? Or do we densify inside the current urban boundary? And the kind of games that were played there, as you say, just to make this point, certain folks vying for heroism and trying to, march forward on this point, should have been something that if they looked at their own priorities, their own pillars, the things they say they stand for every day, those things at the bottom of every city report that say, we're the best city for this reason and this reason and this reason. If they stood behind those things and made sure that those values were enacted, perhaps residents wouldn't have to push so hard for some of the most simple things to be implemented.
Lynda, let me just go to you on this, because you mentioned that we're in the midst of a climate crisis. And my family had the opportunity to go across to BC this August in an RV. And one of the things that my kids said is that they felt that they experienced climate change firsthand because they went through a drought on the prairies for a week. And when they were in Ontario, we couldn't have campfires because of a fire warning. And then we got into BC and we were literally driving through fires with, helicopters with water above the highway where we were driving, dumping water on the fires. And we didn't think we could get back to Alberta after that. And then just this past week, my husband was in BC covering the flooding and the mudslides, right? I mean, it's happening. We saw Manhattan, if we want to bring it closer to where we are, we saw Manhattan get flooded, its subway system, and people drown in basement apartments. So, Lynda, how is it that it took 18,000 plus citizens to get council to bring us down to that nail biter vote around expanding the urban boundary? I mean, why does it take so much work by Environment Hamilton and citizens to have them recognize really the existential threat?
I'm going to start by saying I'm elated with the vote, with the outcome, but I agree. It took a whole lot of community mobilization and a whole lot of effort, and it's not done yet. So I would say, there's a climate emergency. We're seeing it happen all around us. It breaks my heart when I hear stories about, your kids acknowledging this is happening, because I worry, I'm deeply worried about the future for kids on this planet. Makes me very concerned. It's the biggest source of stress in my life, and I'm sure more and more other Hamiltonians and Canadians with what we're seeing. But this decision is a good one. And the work that needs to be done is work that really helps to amplify all of the interconnections, right down to the level of, the poorly housed or the unhoused in our community. And I think pushing in this direction, for a lot of people, they may have been compelled by the saving farmland piece, but the framework that we can build to replace the approach that we've used for so long, that constant marching outwards into rural Hamilton, is an approach that can address all of these challenges. And I think that's what makes me feel really excited and hopeful about this. It feels like we've come together collectively. We've pushed a giant boulder up the hill, but there's a paradigm shift happening. And if we get it right, the outcomes could be fantastic for our community and build a better place, a more climate resilient, a more inclusive Hamilton for everyone moving forward.
Let me ask you, Cameron, do you see all these different pieces? They're environmental issues, but they're also issues around equity and issues around inclusion and issues around sustainability. Like, do you see them all kind of sort of coming together in Hamilton? And do you have hope that maybe it will change how we make our decisions and the kind of maybe even leaders that we elect?
Absolutely, I have hope, Laura, because what I'm seeing now, and I haven't lived in Hamilton my whole life, so I can't speak back to 20 years ago. But in the last 7 or 8, I am seeing a lot of increased collaboration. I'm seeing everyone seeing each other and saying, hey, this issue you have is connected to what's going on with me. How can we work together? We saw that with the Stop Sprawl movement. We've seen that in all the calls over the last week to investigate what happened with policing and encampments. And we've seen that from a lot of neighbors who've been showing up increasingly to support those folks who don't have safe or affordable housing. So that increased compassion is happening. I see that from Hamiltonians. Even during a time when a lot of people have less, during a pandemic, which has really, frankly, rocked the world and rocked our city in lots of ways, still we're seeing that outpouring of compassion from people. It's kind of in part slightly seeing a reimagining of our existing spaces, how we can be more inclusive. I think when we started thinking about pushing the urban boundary out, a lot of people started turning to the places in their own neighborhood saying, well, wait a minute, don't we have space here already to accommodate this growth? Can't we reimagine some of these things? We're talking about a 30-year horizon here for growth. We can do a lot in 30 years, right? If we come together and work together on this and change our zoning and start looking at different ways of densifying within the urban boundary, how that would work if we all put our focus on that, put our focus on affordable housing, and put our focus on equity and inclusion, like what could that result be? And so it's been really inspirational to watch that, frankly, over the last while.
What frustrates me, I feel your hope, because I do see that it's a sea change. Everyone is working together. There doesn't seem to be any more this organization, that cause, this cause. Everybody is like, yeah, we're all in it together because we've got to get this city on track, right? I mean, we are so far behind on so many fronts, and just on the housing one alone. I know Indwell is doing some great projects and there are people doing some great stuff locally. But if you look at with the encampments, what Kitchener is doing, a better tent city where they're providing plumbing and safety for people in encampments while we work on this affordable housing crisis. In London, I think it was taking part of their civic golf course that's not used in the winter and building temporary housing for these individuals, right? I mean, we're not where Finland is, where they give them starter apartments and they've made a huge impact on the homeless issue in their country. But in these other Canadian cities, smaller than ours, they are coming up with compassionate, innovative solutions in the temporary. I can only imagine what they're doing in terms of zoning and finding affordable housing opportunities with the existing stuff that they have. And let me just touch on this with you, since it brought me to my mind. Didn't you do a map? And I don't know if Lynda was involved with it as well, or who all was involved with it, where you identified all of the spaces that we have to densify within our urban boundary. Cameron, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. The Downtown Sparrow collaborated with folks in Stop Sprawl, got together, about a dozen volunteers in total. Dr. Lukasik helped with it. Some other people gave advice. And what we did was we just said this, we answered that existential question. In my own neighborhood, are there spaces we can reimagine to densify, to change the way we live, to make this more inclusive, to build all kinds of different housing? And the answer to that question was resoundingly yes. And volunteers, painstakingly, I'll say, hand traced polygons on a map, little shapes all over a map, identifying parking lots and vacant land and all kinds of things to, I think, in a kind of beautiful way, reimagine what these spaces might look like. And no, we can't tomorrow go and turn every one of these spaces into housing, but some can be depaved, some can be earmarked for affordable housing. Some vacant lands can be made into park spaces and green spaces for the increasing density. We're going to need more green spaces in our city to accommodate that increasing density. So with this kind of recipe, and we found about just around 3,300 more so acres, about the same amount of space that was potentially going to be expanded with the urban boundary expansion in these spaces. Doesn't even include most of the city-owned property about 1,000 acres, which they identify as, they call it underutilized or vacant land. So there's a huge amount of potential here. That exercise was meant to, I hope, spark some interest and imagination, right? It's not perfect. It was done by volunteers, but the idea is that it's going to keep the conversation going. And I'd love to hear from Lynda specifically about how she sees those impacts, right? And where we can go to make sure that that environmental justice piece is attuned to.
Lynda?
Yeah, I think the visual is always inspiring, and the work that Cameron and so many dedicated volunteers did provides that visual inspiration to get Hamiltonians talking, and I think that's really important. On the houseless crisis, you know, I acknowledge what you're saying, Laura. There are these acute needs that Hamilton needs to get more innovative in addressing. You know, a lot of what we're talking about, just in terms of a paradigm shift, we hope is going to address all of these issues longer term, but we can't wait. But at the same time, I'm going to say, in thinking about that longer term, that 30-year time frame, you know, getting the conversations going in the way that Cameron and others have with this mapping is critically important. There are other pieces too that are related. And one I want to throw out there is the term yellow belt that we're hearing being thrown around a lot in Toronto. And we've got it too. So yellow belt is all of that low density residential area in the city. So most of our urban neighborhoods are yellow belt too. And we've got, you know, innovative folks in Toronto talking about unlocking the yellow belt, that already serviced land. And so that's where the conversation as well becomes really important around residential zoning and revamping, reviewing and updating that zoning. And in Hamilton, we know the city has started a residential zones project, and that's what brought us the second dwelling unit policies that are now in place that allow for laneway and garden suites and a second dwelling unit within an existing residential property. But there are more stages and phases to that project, and it seems to be frozen right now. So we want to see that project proceed. That's going to be critically important to build on all of this conversation that we're starting at the community level. We're, you know, the pieces that are out there are really helping Hamiltonians to be open to conversations about neighborhood change and how we can creatively accommodate more people within the existing urban boundary. Other jurisdictions are doing this. That's where we're getting inspiration. Toronto's having that conversation. There's incredible stuff happening in Portland, Oregon, and I know we talk about Portland a lot, but they've got a wonderful example that helps people to understand this isn't scary stuff. This isn't 50-story towers next to single-family homes. This is learning how to do this in a way that's inclusive, that builds stronger, better communities in the process. So I think a lot of us now are saying, come on, let's get on with this. Let's start this conversation. Let's transform our city in positive ways.
I love the fact that you're talking about best practice elsewhere, because we don't need to make it up for ourselves. We can take things from other people who have found solutions. We're all in this planet together. You know, if other places have found ways to mitigate climate change, to better use their within their urban boundary, to build up better equitable cities, to get people out of living rough and chronic homelessness, I mean, we can copy their ideas. So it's reimagining Hamilton. But I think, to your point, it's also about saying, hey, listen, this is starting elsewhere. You know, this is where things are going now. This is how we should use our land. Cameron, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it can be an inspirational time. I think we need leaders in our city who see that vision, see that potential, and see that in a way where they're connecting with not only their local community, but the whole city of Hamilton, and realizing the potential here and moving that forward on their own. They're coming to the table with these ideas. They're putting them forward. They're advancing them. I think that that kind of trust between leaders and communities is missing right now. And we're seeing the communities and sometimes random volunteers, people on the side of their desks, pushing and doing all this work. And I think, frankly, Hamiltonians deserve a bit of a break. We deserve leadership that's not requiring so many off hours to convince folks to take these things seriously.
So whether it's a reimagining or new leadership required, you both inspired me that maybe this city can reach its potential. You know, maybe we can get this right. We certainly have the old bones for it, right? We certainly have a beautiful city in so many ways. We just haven't done a tremendous amount of great planning. So let me just end the show on this, Lynda. what would be sort of the one thing that you would love to see both the volunteer Hamiltonians who are watching this program, but also I know that our elected officials also watch the program. What is it that you would like for us all to do or to focus on to reduce the cost to our environment?
In that firm urban boundary home, because I think everything that will flow out of that decision is going to get us that climate resilient, inclusive Hamilton that we're all so passionate about making reality. And I just want to say, you know, at the same time that I totally hear you in terms of volunteer power really fueling the shift in Hamilton, it's also part of who we are. So I think at the same time, I want to acknowledge and celebrate that, because I think Hamilton is really a special place in terms of the willingness of so many people, because we care. And I'm not saying that people in other communities don't care about their communities, but there's something really amazing about Hamilton in the way that we all step up. And sometimes we're scrappy about it, but that's part of how we get things done, and that's part of how we make change happen. So I would say that let's bring that decision home and let's make it work. Let's do the heavy lifting that we need to do to make it work on the ground, so that we have, you know, a positive future for everyone.
I love that, Lynda. Cameron, a last thought on what you would have people focus on or have people make their priority?
I'm with Lynda in terms of this idea that it's not just about a vote at council, it's about all the other steps that come along with making that a reality. We tend to be focused on what happens around the council table, and on the show, it makes sense to do that. But there are so many more moving pieces. Lynda's completely right that half that equation or a third of that equation or more than half sometimes are Hamiltonians getting behind things, Hamiltonians volunteering to put these things in place in their own neighborhoods and communities. And so I think it's got to be a work together mentality. And I think at the end of the day, this city deserves better. We all see the potential that we have in Hamilton. We see, as you say, the old bones. We see the structure of this city. We see the water. We see the escarpment. We see our natural environment. And we see the strength of communities in this city. So let's leverage that. Let's put it to work and do something beautiful.
I love that gritty, scrappy, engaged feeling of Hamilton, right? We're not a boring town. And sometimes people think that our scrappiness and our critique is somehow a negativity. It isn't. It is an optimism that is trying to push through to get to that reimagined city that we all know can happen. So, and is happening. And so I thank you guys for your volunteer and the paid gigs you do, everything you do, and for this conversation. You are, of course, the voices that are trusted on the issues that Hamiltonians care about. Thank you both so much for doing the OShow, and be safe.